Some doors are meant to keep things out. But what if something refuses to stay out? I rented a small cabin one winter weekend, far from the nearest road, tucked between heavy pines. I wanted quiet, a place where I could think, the kind of solitude you can't find in the city anymore. The cabin looked harmless enough. Weathered wood, a crooked chimney, and a porch that leaned just a little to one side. Inside, there was barely enough space for a bed, a stove, and a single chair by the window. But it was enough. The first night passed quietly. I stoked a fire, read a little, and eventually drifted into a deep sleep. The silence was strange, but not unwelcome. The second night, however, I learned the silence wasn't empty. It began with footsteps, soft at first, crunching through the frost outside, then heavier, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. For a long time, there was nothing. And then, the doorknob rattled. It twisted hard, metal scraping, as if someone was testing the lock. My heart froze in my chest. I hadn't expected anyone to be out here. There shouldn't have been anyone. The rattling grew more frantic, shaking violently as though someone was trying to force their way inside. My mind raced. Should I shout? Should I run? Number. I stayed completely still, praying the lock would hold. Minutes dragged like hours. Then suddenly, the rattling stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I waited. The fire hissed softly. The shadows shifted across the walls, but no sound came from outside. Slowly, cautiously, I sat up and pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. The rest of the night passed in fragments of fear and silence. Every creak of the wood felt like a warning. I didn't sleep. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside. My breath clouded in the cold air as I scanned the ground. There were footprints. Human. Bare. Dozens of them stamped deep into the frost, circling the cabin over and over. They stopped at the door, and nowhere else. That was enough for me. I packed my things in minutes, my hands trembling as I shoved everything into my bag. I didn't look around, didn't stop to breathe, just bolted for the car. As I drove down that lonely road, a thought chilled me more than the cold ever could. Those footsteps weren't from an animal. They weren't random. They belonged to someone. Someone who had known I was alone. Someone who had wanted inside. And even now, sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can still hear it. That rattling doorknob. The night was calm. The kind of calm that feels almost too perfect. He sat inside the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, the soft glow of a lamp painting the wooden walls in gold. Outside, the forest stretched endless and dark, silent except for the faint rustle of leaves. For a while, he thought he had found the peace he was searching for. But then, he heard it. At first it was so faint. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks. Slow, heavy breathing. Not his own. Not the creak of the cabin, but breathing. Steady, rhythmic, just outside his window. He froze. Every instinct told him not to move. The lamp flickered and his reflection in the glass trembled as he leaned closer. His pulse thundered in his ears, but the sound outside did not stop. Inhale. Exhale. Deep, deliberate, almost human. He waited. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then, slowly, it faded. Gone. Relief washed over him, though it didn't last long. He tried to settle, convincing himself it had been the wind, the trees shifting in the night. But when he lay down, pulling the blanket close, the sound returned. Louder, closer, right against the thin wall of the cabin. The breathing followed him. He turned off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room, and he sat perfectly still, trying to listen, trying not to make a sound. The breathing grew heavier, almost ragged now, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew he was listening. And then, knuckles brushed against the glass. His stomach dropped. He didn't dare look. The window was just a few feet away, but his body refused to move. Every part of him screamed to run, yet his legs were frozen in place. The breathing pressed closer, fogging the window he couldn't bring himself to face. Inhale. Exhale. The glass creaked as though a weight leaned against it. He shut his eyes, clutching the blanket like it might protect him. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. At some point, the sound faded again. He never heard footsteps, never heard anyone leave. Just silence. When morning came, the cabin looked the same. The forest stood still, the air calm. But when he finally turned to the window, his blood ran cold. The glass was smeared with condensation, as if someone had stood there all night, breathing, watching, waiting. Sometimes the forest feels empty, but sometimes something is already living there. It was late autumn when I decided to go camping alone. The idea sounded perfect. A few days in the crisp mountain air, away from work, away from noise, just me and the stillness of the forest. I packed light, a tent, some food, a lantern, and enough supplies to last the weekend. The hike in was long, the path littered with fallen leaves and the occasional patch of frost. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By the time I reached a clearing and set up camp, night was already falling. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate my dinner, and watched the stars glitter between the treetops. The silence felt calm, almost comforting. But on the second night, everything changed. I was drifting to sleep when I heard it. Crunch. Footsteps in the leaves. My eyes snapped open. I froze, listening. Another crunch. Closer this time. My mind raced. Animal? Deer? Bear? I sat perfectly still, heart hammering, waiting for it to pass. When the sound finally faded, I let out a shaky breath and told myself it was nothing. Just wildlife. Nothing unusual. But when morning came, I found something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. Large, human, pressed deep into the soil around my tent. At first, I thought maybe I had made them the day before. But no, these were fresh, the edges sharp. They circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to brush it off, but the unease followed me all day. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep animals, or whoever had been there, away. I stayed awake for as long as I could, staring into the dark. Sometime after midnight, the noises started again. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping, the sound of slow, deliberate steps moving just beyond the glow of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight, hands shaking, and pointed it into the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trunks. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing came closer. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have dozed off. When I woke at dawn, the fire had gone out. I stepped outside the tent, my stomach sinking. More footprints, dozens this time. Circling the campsite again and again, pressed deep into the soil. I didn't waste another second. I packed everything into my bag and followed the trail back toward the main road. But as I hiked out, something caught my eye. A small clearing, just off the path. There, hidden between the trees, was a makeshift camp. A crude shelter made of branches, blankets, empty cans. Someone had been living there, watching. I didn't stay to look closer. I ran until the road came into view, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. Later, when I told the authorities, they only nodded, said it wasn't the first time. People had been reporting strange encounters out there for years, and even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. That slow, steady crunch of footsteps circling my tent. Sometimes the woods whisper warnings, but sometimes they write them down. I had always loved the mountains, the stillness, the crisp air, the way the world seemed to slow down up there. So when I found a small cabin for rent, tucked away far from the nearest town, I booked it without hesitation. A weekend in the quiet wilderness sounded perfect. The cabin was old, clearly weathered by years of storms, but it had a certain charm. The wooden steps groaned as I walked up, and the door stuck before opening with a reluctant creak. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and dust. There was a single bed, a stone fireplace, and a table scarred with scratches from years of use. The first day was peaceful. I hiked a little, breathed in the cold mountain air, and sat outside as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, at least not yet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small, but safe. That night, however, everything changed. I woke to a sound. Soft, deliberate. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal. But no. The rhythm was too steady, too human. They circled the cabin slowly, crunching across the frost-covered ground. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in the bed, listening. Then, the sound stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. I stared into the dark, waiting. Just as I began to convince myself it was only my imagination, I heard it again. A faint creak, not outside, on the porch. Something or someone was right there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to move. Eventually, the first rays of dawn spilled through the window. My body ached from staying so tense, but I forced myself to stand. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in. My eyes dropped immediately to the ground. Footprints, dozens of them, bare feet, human, pressed deep into the frozen soil, circling the cabin again and again. My stomach turned as I followed them with my eyes. They led up the porch steps, right to the cabin wall. And that's where I saw it. A piece of paper nailed into the wood with a rusty spike. The edges flapped gently in the breeze. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled it free. On the paper, in rough, uneven handwriting, were two words: "Leave now." My blood went cold. I didn't stop to think. I didn't pack properly. I grabbed what I could, shoved it into my bag, and ran to the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The sound of the engine roaring to life, the only comfort I had. I drove down the mountain without looking back. Every turn in the road a blur. And though I never returned, sometimes I wonder, was it a warning to protect me? Or a threat for what would happen if I stayed? Sometimes silence is a gift, but sometimes silence is where the darkness hides. It was last February, bitterly cold, with long nights that seemed to stretch forever. I was 22, and I had just finished my final semester of college. Everything in my life was about to change. I had a new job waiting, new responsibilities, a new routine. But before stepping into that next chapter, I wanted one last break. So, I booked a small cabin on the edge of a town called Norfield. It was about 3 hours from where I lived. I had never heard of the place before, but that was the point. I wanted somewhere quiet, far from the noise, far from people. Somewhere I could be completely alone. The drive there was uneventful. The farther I got from the city, the more the road narrowed, winding through thick patches of pine and bare winter trees. The snow was fresh but shallow, crunching under the tires as I pulled up to the cabin. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. Wooden walls, a sloped roof dusted with snow, and a small front porch that looked out onto nothing but forest. The inside was simple. A little kitchen, a living space with an old sofa, a bedroom and a bathroom tucked at the back. Cozy, but quiet. Too quiet. At first I told myself this was what I wanted. No honking horns, no chatter from neighbors, just the stillness of the woods. I unpacked, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window as the evening light faded. But then, night fell, and that silence I had been craving began to feel heavy. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick, almost unnatural. The kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The first night passed slowly. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the wind outside felt magnified. I told myself it was nothing. Old cabins make noise. Trees shift in the wind. I forced myself to sleep. The second night, I wasn't so lucky. I had just drifted off when I heard it. Thud. A sharp, heavy sound against the side of the cabin. I froze. My eyes darted to the ceiling as if I could see through it. A moment later came another noise. A slow, dragging sound across the porch. Someone or something was moving out there. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My phone had no service. The cabin had no landline. I was cut off. After what felt like an eternity, the dragging stopped. The silence returned. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into uneasy sleep. By the third night, I was on edge. I kept the lights on longer, double-checked the lock on the door, and sat listening to every small sound the cabin made. Midnight crept closer. The fire burned low. My eyes grew heavy. Then, I heard it again. The dragging steps, slow, deliberate, moving across the porch. My chest tightened. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. That's when it happened. The doorknob began to turn. At first, just a twitch, then a slow, steady twist like someone testing it. The metal rattled softly. I felt every muscle in my body lock up, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting, praying the lock would hold. It kept turning, then stopped. A silence so deep followed that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a faint exhale, a breath, on the other side of the door. And just like that, the sound was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat up, staring at that door, until dawn finally painted the windows gray. When the first light hit, I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside, and bolted for the car. I didn't look back. Not once. But even now, sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I think about that cabin, and I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door? Sometimes the woods feel alive, and sometimes they really are watching. A friend of mine had a small cabin on the edge of a forest. One weekend he offered it to me, said I could use it to clear my head, maybe relax away from the noise of the city. I didn't hesitate. The thought of spending a few days in nature, No deadlines, no distractions. Felt like exactly what I needed. The drive there was calm. The sun filtered through the trees, and the winding road seemed endless. By the time I reached the cabin, the air was cooler, fresher, the kind that fills your lungs in a way city air never could. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a fireplace, a small table, and a bed tucked into the corner. The windows looked out over the woods, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. At first, it was peaceful. I walked around outside, listened to the wind, and let the stillness sink in. But as the day faded, the forest changed. The air grew heavy, thick with silence. I noticed something odd. The trees seemed different, as though their positions had shifted ever so slightly. When I looked away and then looked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had moved closer. I laughed at myself, told myself it was only my imagination, a trick of the light. But still, the thought lingered. That night, after cooking a small meal, I sat by the fire. The flames cracked and popped, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. For a while, I let myself drift, enjoying the warmth, but when I glanced toward the window, my heart skipped. There was something, standing in the trees. A tall figure, still watching. At first, I thought it must have been a trick of the firelight, but no. The shape didn't waver. It didn't move like a shadow. It stood there, half hidden among the trunks, its outline dark and unmistakable. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move, didn't shift. It just watched. I closed the curtains, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. A tree stump, a shadow, anything but what it looked like. Eventually, I forced myself to lie down, though every sound outside made me flinch. Morning came, but the unease didn't leave. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. No figure, no footprints. Just the forest, quiet and endless. Relieved, I packed up early and drove back to the city. I thought the fear would fade once I was surrounded by people again. But I was wrong, because a few nights later, I saw it again. In an alleyway near my apartment, the same tall, still figure, watching from the shadows. And that's when I realized, whatever had been in those woods hadn't stayed there. Some cabins protect you from the wild, but others invite the wild inside. I had been feeling drained for weeks. Work, life, and the constant pressure of the city. So, when I found a listing for a remote mountain cabin, I didn't think twice. A weekend away, no phone service, no noise, just me and the stillness of nature. That was the plan. The drive there took me up narrow roads that twisted through steep hills. The higher I went, the thinner the air felt, and the thicker the forest grew. Pines crowded close to the road, their branches bare in the cold air, their roots tangled like veins. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, sinking behind the mountains. It was small, worn from years of weather, but sturdy. Inside, the wooden walls were dark with age. The floor creaked underfoot, and the fireplace sat cold and unused. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. I unpacked, lit a fire, and told myself this would be the peaceful retreat I needed. The first night passed without incident. Just the sound of the wind rattling against the roof and the crackle of the fire. I told myself this was exactly what I had wanted. The second night, however, I began to notice something strange. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping on the walls. At first, I thought it was just branches in the wind. But when I stepped outside in the morning, the trees stood far back from the cabin, too far for their branches to reach. By the third night, the sound grew louder. I was lying in bed when it began. Scratch. A long, deliberate scrape against the wood. My eyes shot open. I held my breath, listening. A moment later came another. Scratch. This time from the other side of the cabin. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. Something was moving around outside, dragging claws or nails against the walls. I sat frozen, staring at the door, every muscle tight with fear. Then came a heavy thud, as if something had slammed a hand or a fist against the wood. My heart raced. The noises circled the cabin, scraping and pounding, then stopping suddenly, only to start again on another wall. I couldn't move. I couldn't even look out the window. I stayed perfectly still, praying the lock would hold, praying whatever it was would leave. By morning, silence returned. When the first light crept through the curtains, I forced myself outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The cabin walls were covered in marks. Deep, jagged scratches carved into the wood. Dozens of them. They ran across the boards like something had been trying to claw its way in. But there were no tracks. No footprints in the snow. No sign of anything that could have made them. I packed my things in a panic and left that morning. The drive back down the mountain felt endless. Every shadow in the trees making me grip the wheel tighter. I never returned to that cabin. But sometimes, late at night, when my apartment is quiet, I swear I hear it again. That same sound, scratch, dragging slowly against the wall.